Thank you, Secretary Jaspers. Before proceeding into session one of our agenda, throughout the day I'll be recognizing some of our sponsors as Secretary Jaspers did right now at RCP&E and Bank West for supporting this year's summit. Please join me in thanking them. As producers, we put the health of our livestock as a top priority. Many of these diseases that once plagued our industry have been eradicated, and modern technology has been a major contributor to this. Our first panelists of the day are leaders in this area, and we are quite privileged to welcome them to the stage. Our moderator for this panel is well known to most of us here. Dr. Dustin Odekoven serves as our South Dakota State Veterinarian and the Executive Secretary for the South Dakota Animal Industry Board. Dr. Odekoven will be moderating our discussion today with Dr. Apley and Dr. Jim Roth. Dr. Mike Apley is a veterinarian with a PhD in physiology. Dr. Apley teaches beef production, medicine, large animal medicine, and pharmacology courses. He is currently a professor in the Department of Veterinary Clinical Sciences at Kansas State University. His research interests include infectious diseases, antibiotics efficiency and resistance, drug residues, and applications of drugs in food animals. Dr. Jim Roth is a distinguished professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State University. Dr. Roth is the director of the Center for Food Security and Public Health and the instructor for international cooperation in animal biologics. Dr. Roth's primary area of research expertise is in immunity to infectious diseases of food-producing animals. Please help me welcome our panelists for the day. Dustin, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you, Craig. I'm not sure that I have much of a role as the moderator here, other than I think at the end of last year, when the crew with the Ag Department was talking about wrap up from the summit, I said, hey, we ought to do something on animal health sometime. And so along about December, Jody contacted me and said, remember you said we should do something on animal health? Well, we need some ideas. So I handed her, or I probably sent an email, a day-long agenda of things we could talk about for animal health, and she said, no, we're going to do a panel, keep it short. So so I had to cut it down quite a bit, and I'm very pleased in the two gentlemen that agreed to come and visit with us today. I don't know if they'll admit it, but they were both professors when I was in veterinary school at Iowa State, so I had to pay a lot of tuition to hear these guys. You get to hear them for free today. This will be great for you. So very excited to welcome both of these guys here today to our Ag Summit, and I think they've got some very timely topics to share with us. So who's up first? Dr. Apley. Okay, Dr. Apley, please come and come to the podium. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I've always wanted to give Jim's talk. I might just wing it. Is that okay, Jim? You can do mine. We'll have some fun. Well, good morning. Thanks for the invitation. There we are. Great. And I can pick the spot on the road north of Maxville, Kansas, where I decided to go back and do my PhD in look pharmacology with a real interest in antibiotics and food animals back in 1989. And I was going to go back and solve the issues of treating calves with respiratory disease with antibiotics, and you can see that I've still got job security here. But yeah, 28 years later or so. So our use of antibiotics in animal agriculture has become an integral part of our management of infectious disease. It's become a part of control, it's become a part of prevention, and of course treatment. And one of the questions I always ask audiences is, do you think animal agriculture today is dependent on antibiotics? How many would think so? Well, I disagree with all of you. I think we're entirely dependent on antibiotics in a lot of our production systems. And what I find is that groups of veterinarians feel that we are. And you see a lot of veterinarians go, yeah, for mine. And we get defensive about it because it's like saying we aren't being good stewards of what we're doing. But when you think about it, and you think about multiple different proteins, we have developed production systems where antibiotics are absolutely integral into controlling and treating infectious disease in at least some time during the production of that protein. So it is a part of it, and modern agriculture has evolved to make the most efficient use of multiple inputs. And if you start naming those off, water, fuel, labor, feed, facilities, all of those are changing, and antibiotics is one of those things that allows us to address the health of animals. So we're going to go through a few of the challenges here that are facing our use in agriculture and exactly what we're doing. So first, I want to talk about what veterinarians are being asked to do. And veterinarians are being asked to head up antibiotic stewardship. And by that, I mean we're first responsible for appropriate diagnostics and case definitions. One of the things that's coming to animal agriculture and is going to become standard practice are written protocols, standard operating procedures for defining disease, and standard operating procedures for how we address disease. We, as an agricultural profession, cannot move forward in our relationship with consumers and supply chains without documenting what we do and the reasons for what we do. And then if we do find we have the need for antibiotics, the first question is there a non-antibiotic alternative which will appropriately prevent, control, or treat this disease challenge, which is laying a nice segue into Dr. Ross' talk about immunity and disease prevention. This involves how we handle animals. It involves our move to backgrounding cattle and how we bring them into feedlots in my area of the world. It involves a lot of different things, but it says we need to be focused on ways without an antibiotic to address these. And then once we've said, yep, we need to use an antibiotic, now we have to use something that's safe and effective. Hopefully we're beyond the days now of the old compounding practices where a lot of people had their own mix of antibiotics and we'd put those in with no idea about residues, no idea about efficacy, etc. And we're beyond that. Extra-label use of gentamicin for respiratory disease. You know, that was irresponsible. It's still irresponsible because of the residues we leave. We've got a lot of good labeled products, and we're moving forward in areas like that, coming to a consensus of exactly how we should be doing that. And frankly, it's a lot more public what we're doing now today. And then assuring use of the antibiotic as it is shown to be safe and effective. This goes back to a constant interaction between the veterinarian and the producer. The Veterinary Feed Directive has brought out a lot of those interactions that weren't there before. And, you know, as has been mentioned earlier this morning, we tend to ruffle up a little bit more at more regulations being foisted upon us. But the Veterinary Feed Directive has driven a lot of conversations between producers and veterinarians about exactly what is legal and what actually has effect. And frankly, when you start looking at drugs like chlortetracycline in the feed, I wonder if a lot of what we've done over the years hasn't been habit instead of really what we needed to do. So those types of tough discussions are happening in a very, very high and visible environment. And then, of course, the last thing is always to ask, is this antibiotic intervention still necessary? We used this for foot rot 20 years ago, or we did this, Grandpa did this. Is it still really necessary to do that? And those are the hard questions that come out when we start putting together protocols and writing standard operating procedures for what we're doing. And if not, let's stop it. If yes, come back to, is there a non-antibiotic alternative? Vaccines, how we handle the cattle. For example, if we're going to calve heifers in a lot, and it's muddy, and those udders are covered with the manure, and we're wondering why we're getting scour problems in the calves. We can't fix that with a needle. You can't cram management through a needle. Let's get them out on grass. Let's get them into a rotational calving system. Let's do those types of things. Look at immunological possibilities. Go back to the quality of colostrum in those heifers. Fetal programming is becoming more and more of a reality to us on what happens in that cow. You know, if we're calving out body condition score 3.5 or 4 cows and wondering why we're having problems in those calves, the answer's back on the cow. So all those things, all those management things we do, we're being asked to focus on. So then the question comes, well, what are we using? What are we doing that's causing people to wonder about us? Well, the number one is the tetracyclines, and if you look at our 2015 data over here, I'm going to make sure, that's not the one. There we are. Right here, the tetracyclines are the large bar. About 40% of overall use and about 70% of medically important antibiotic use are the tetracyclines, and the majority of that would be chlortetracycline or oxytetracycline through the feed and water. But our in-feed use dominates. This is just a list of the different drugs. Obviously, we're not going to plow through that, but the fluoroquinolones, cephalosporins, ones that are very, very high in importance on our therapy in humans, we use a very, very small percent of those. They're way, way less than 1% of use, like down 0.2%. But our in-feed use dominates. If you look here on the medically important drugs, how they're given, 74% of the total of medically important goes through the feed, 21% through the water, so that's about 95%. Prior to January 1 of this year, the vast majority of those were over the counter, almost all of them except for a very few veterinary feed directive drugs. As of January 1, all of those water medications are now under the requirement for a prescription from a veterinarian, and all of the in-feed use of a medically important antibiotic is now required to be under the authorization of a veterinary feed directive, as you're all well aware of by now. And that's why the 10-gram chlortetracycline crumbles and the 4 grams are gone from the feed store unless they take a VFD, and why the water-soluble tetracyclines and sulfas are off the shelf at the feed store unless they're set up to take a prescription. Those now, so it's 95% of our medically important use was going through routes which were over the counter and not involving a veterinarian. And that's the future of antibiotic use in animal ag, is that veterinary oversight and interaction is going to be expected. The last few that you can still buy at the feed store, penicillin G, long-acting oxytetracycline, some injectable Tylosin. Those are still there, but probably within the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see those go to requiring a veterinary prescription also. In the state of California, under Senate Bill 27, starting January 1, 2018, those will be under the prescription, so we have states that are going ahead. Maryland has passed a bill. One is in front of the legislature in Oregon. There are states that are taking it into their own hands to move beyond the FDA requirements. And one of the things that's, I believe, for Maryland and for sure in California, is they move beyond just saying no growth promotion uses of medically important antibiotics, and they say we are also going to prohibit routine prevention practices with them. So we're seeing things happen in the states that are going above and beyond the FDA, which creates a very interesting situation. So here's what's happened with the tetracycline use here over the years. So since these data, sales data, were reported in 2009, every year we've steadily climbed in the tetracycline use, and again, that's primarily feed, some water. A lot of questions about why is that happening, and I'm sure that when the 2016 data get posted with all the stockpiling it had, there was a lot of sales pressure put on the market from people trying to take advantage of the concern about this, and they moved a whole lot of chlortetracycline bulk and products at the end of 2016. So we're going to be explaining why this arrow is going to bend sharply up probably for 2016. Yeah, that's just highlighting that cephalosporins are a very, very, very small part of what we're doing. And there's the feed. Excuse me, I'm going to go back to that one. There's what's happened. This thing is like the jitterbug evades me. This is the in-feed consumption. So in-feed is where a lot of that tetracycline use is driving, so we're seeing a dramatic increase in in-feed use. And I'm just saying we need to have a clear plan for when we decide to put this in the feed, have a reason for doing it. And there's what's happened, the percent change since 2015, since 2009 to 2015, 26% for in-feed use and 41% for water use. So the changes in veterinary oversight, the VFD is the big one for the producers in this room, and a lot of it's been with mineral. If you run into issues with pasture mineral, you're well aware now that the chlortetracycline label in mineral is only for control of anaplasmosis. Foot rot and pink eye's never been on the label, and that's been kind of ignored. In my state, I can speak specifically that the issue of a feed being fed free choice, having to be approved as a free choice feed, has been completely ignored by the FDA. The FDA has not enforced that for around 20 years. And now all of a sudden, this ruling has put veterinarians in the spot of having to decide whether or not they will authorize something that's not on the label. And they can't legally do that for foot rot or pink eye. And that's caused a lot of grief. The FDA's kind of thrown the veterinarian out there. We've had repeated conversations with him. They go, yeah, we know that's going on, and we still have the situation. So if you're running into that, that has been an issue. VFDs can only be written. It's for feed, free choice feed, hand-fed feed, milk, milk replacer, or all of those. And there is absolutely no extra label use. And so everyone in here has gone through that transition. We're still working through some of the issues, some of the free choice feed issues. There were a lot of understandings that had to be developed about milk versus milk replacer. So you need to have those conversations with your veterinarians. And I have a lot of conversations with veterinarians that are working through this. So we have a system for that. And all feed under the VFD, no extra label use in water. Veterinarians may prescribe extra label use. So it's a big difference. So what are medically important antibiotics that we're talking about? Oxytec, Chlortet, Tylosin, Lincomycin, Neomycin are examples. Ones that are not are the ionophores, so Rumensin, Bovatec, Catalyst are trade names, Decoquinate, Amprolium, which is Corid, Bacitracin, Carbadox in the swine side, Mecadox. Those are not medically important, do not require a VFD. But if they're going to be fed with a drug that's VFD, they have to be on the VFD also, if they're with a VFD drug. There's a lot of concern about the ionophores and preserving the use of these compounds for us in cattle. And if you're a cattle feeder, you know well about the ionophores. And they are classified as an antibiotic in the United States. In Europe, they're classified as an anticoccidial. There's a lot of concern that they may get pulled into the medically important antibiotic discussion when they're not, so lots of groups are working on that. The FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine is very careful to put these out as a totally separate class, not medically important. So here's what's spinning around to get us into this whole issue, and that's human versus animal use. So let's look at the comparison on what's going on. These are the antibiotic use classes. Cephalosporins are very, very important. Penicillin, sulfas, those are all used a lot more by human medicine. The fluoroquinolones, this is on the wrong line. This should be up here for quinolones. 277,000 kilograms on the human side, about 20,000 total for food animals in 2015. One of the interesting things is the human side has failed to release any data since 2011. There's a lot of activist groups busy beating up on animal ag, but the human side won't release their data since 2011. So it's a double standard we're working under right now as we go through these comparisons. I can assure you that human use is not on the decline. Although they are well aware there are problems, and there are a lot of really good things going on. Some of the things that are really innovative on their side, there are some groups that use a delayed prescription. So you come in to your doctor's office and you have a upper respiratory problem or a bronchitis, which data would suggest do not need an antibiotic that often, and some places are using a delayed description that's good in 48 hours, and if you still feel bad, you go fill that prescription then, and they find that the prescriptions are actually, only 20 or 30% filled because people are better without the antibiotic and they didn't need them. So a lot of innovative things going on. So don't take any of my comments as meaning they aren't very, very actively pursuing this on the human side. It's very active, just as we are on the veterinary side. I'd just like to see some data from it. We do dominate in the aminoglycosides, so neomycin, gentamicin, and the macrolides are the real big elephant in the room. So macrolides include tylosin for liver abscesses, tylosin for use in cattle, tylosin for use in the feed, prevention and control in pigs, and then we have a lot of injectable macrolides which don't make up that big a part of it compared to the in-feed. But if you've ever had a Z-Pack, azithromycin, that is the human version of some of the macrolides. There's a lot of different macrolides, but that's one of them. So these are very, very high profile, making them one of the drugs that's a lot of discussion about. And right now the FDA has picked as their next big focus as medically important antibiotics used in food animals that do not have a defined duration of administration. So we can use those for an undefined period for prevention or control of disease to an entire population. And there's about 12 different labels they're looking at. Tylosin for liver abscesses would be one of them that they've asked for input on. So let's talk a little bit about resistance. And resistance is real. It's real on the human side and it's real on the veterinary side. So in 1910, if any of us had an issue with an infectious disease as people, our only real option was arsphenamine, which was an arsenic derivative. And it was hoped that it was toxic to the bug just a little bit earlier than it was toxic to us. And so that's 107 years ago, we only had an arsenic derivative as our option. And we've gone through a huge period of antibiotic use, and in the 50s and 60s and 70s, every time we turned around, we not only got a new antibiotic, we got a new antibiotic group. And in 1985, there were two statements made that I think really defined things. One was by the chairman of IBM, who said that the international market for the personal computer was 6 units. 6 computers they could sell internationally for personal use in the home. Okay, so I think there's one that was equally as accurate, and that was that the war on infectious disease has been won. And bacteria take the possum approach to life. They live stupid and have a lot of offspring. That's how bacteria work. They don't consciously plan this, but they have a lot of mutations, and when we apply pressure to a population, we select for those mutations. And that's exactly what we've done. So in veterinary medicine, we've got Staph, Enterococcus, Strep, E. coli, Salmonella, Pseudomonas. These are all challenges for us. At the Kansas State Diagnostic Laboratory, about 70 to 80% of the isolates of Mannheimia hemolytica that we receive, and that is the #1 pathogen in respiratory disease in cattle. So pneumonia in cattle, that's our #1 pathogen. There's others that are in there, but it's very common. 70 to 80% of those isolates that we receive from the cases that are submitted, this isn't a sample of the population, these are the cases that are submitted, 70 to 80% of those are resistant to almost everything we have now. And these are coming in high-risk calves. A lot of those are getting mass-meted at source of origin, and then we get them. But we're seeing that resistance rate, which means when we treat them, our antibiotic isn't going to have an effect, whether it's for control or treatment. And that's really come on since about 2005, 2006, when we've seen a real sharp rise in those in our sample. And that's being reflected around multiple other diagnostic labs that are seeing these types of cattle. So we can select for these things. I just want to show you what that looks like. So here in 2009, this is resistant to 5 organisms. This is susceptible to all of them. So in 2009, we had about 5%, about 25% in 10. In 11, we got up to about 35%. And then we jumped up in, by 13, we're up here to about over 50%. We've came back down. Through 2016, these are staying pretty constant. The difference between these is 1 antibiotic. So you put those together, there's 65, 70% every year that are resistant to most everything we have. So yes, we can select for resistant organisms. So the question becomes, well, how do we compare to humans, and what's this mean to us? Well, this is a bag of vancomycin that was hanging on the stand next to my son's bed when he had a serious injury that a year later came back and was infected with MRSA. You've probably all heard of MRSA, Methicillin-Resistant Staph Aureus. In my neck of the woods down in Kansas, one major hospital, 50 to 60% of the community-acquired staphs now are resistant to methicillin, which means to all penicillins and cephalosporins, and creates a lot of problems, but it's one indication. But on the human side, if you look at the ones that are classified as a threat level of serious, Campylobacter, extended spectrum beta-lactamase Enterobacteriaceae, those we could have a piece of in food animal, but to put it short, if human resistance is this big, right now direct food animal contribution, I think, is about like that. To think that we're driving it all is inaccurate. To say that we have no contribution at all is inaccurate. But this is one of the things that frustrates me in the press. You might, that MRSA, that's really a big hot button on the human side. For us in animal ag, it's important to understand that the strain of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus causing the majority of infections in humans, or the strains, are not from food animals. The ones that we have in food animals, ST398, that's lost its human virulence gene. It can colonize people, but it isn't the one causing the disease problems. So we're always very careful to go through that. And these are just their infections. About, on the human side, 2 million infections, 23,000 deaths. I advocate that we may have a small contribution to that, and it doesn't trivialize this, but our contribution is often overblown. So with this, back to here, I want to close with some comments on the Overton window. And the gentleman with the last name of Overton identified steps that concepts and policies move through in a population, as in us. And it starts with absolutely unacceptable and moves down through about 6 steps to policy. So growth promotion use of medically important antibiotics has gone from unacceptable, or policy, back to unacceptable, right? It's gone. We can no longer use medically important antibiotics for growth promotion in food animals. The use for prevention or control is on the move. It's starting from moving from standard practice down through different groups to policy. And our ability to treat animals with an infectious disease. We have a calf with pneumonia, we have a cow with foot rot. To use an antibiotic to treat that, that is coming under a lot of pressure in certain areas. Where in the United States is the inability to treat an animal with an infectious bacterial disease essentially policy? Are there any production systems where that's standard policy? What are they called? It's organic. Organic production is where I cannot treat that animal, and so if I do, it goes out into another system, right? I can't prevent, control, or treat disease, or in a natural never-ever system. That gets lost in the discussion. I'm completely for being able to produce animals however we want and there's a market for, but I'm also for being transparent about welfare issues that are in with all of them. That's a very big discussion, and as a matter of fact, several major veterinary organizations have now put together groups to deal with the issues of balancing antibiotic use and minimizing it with welfare in our current systems. And it's a little bit of a struggle. So as we watch these policies move through, it's something to keep very, very, very highly aware of. We're watching state movements and we're watching exactly how veterinarians interact. So in order to keep us on schedule, Dusty, I think were we wanting to do a few minutes in questions after each one and then go into the panel? Okay. This will give us plenty of time for discussion, so I'll turn it over to Dr. Roth and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Apley. And I failed as moderator to tee up very well what Dr. Apley was going to visit about. But obviously, you get the point there. I thought a very timely topic to hear about antimicrobial resistance and some of the challenges that we're facing now in production agriculture, not only on the regulatory side, but just the reality of what the science is showing with the antimicrobial resistance and the fact that we're not seeing a lot of new products come to market to help us out there. So really appreciate that overview, and I always appreciate how Dr. Apley relates those things and compares what we're seeing on the animal side and the livestock health to what's on the human side. So certainly appreciate that. Dr. Roth, I have asked Dr. Roth to talk about foreign animal disease outbreaks and other foreign animal disease threats in the United States and what we're doing to prepare for such outbreaks. What are some of the challenges that we're dealing with? And both these gentlemen testified in Congress and been part of national groups that are addressing these type of issues. So we're very fortunate to have them today, and thank you, Dr. Roth.
Thank you, Dr. Odakoven. So today I'm going to talk about work that's ongoing between state and federal regulatory officials and industry and academia, planning for how to manage for a foreign animal disease outbreak, especially focusing on foot and mouth disease. And I'll give away the ending. It's going to be very, very, very bad, even if everybody makes all the right decisions. Foot and mouth disease is going to be very bad if we get it. And I'll go through some of the reasons for that. And we're in a time where we're seeing more and more diseases come into the U.S. that were foreign animal diseases. We've had porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, killed about 8 million baby pigs. High-path avian influenza killed about 50 million head of poultry in just 2 or 3 months' time. And we're having ongoing issues with Seneca Valley virus. The first two came from China. We know that because of the fingerprints of the infectious agents. China has foot and mouth disease. They have classical swine fever. There's a lot of diseases out there we don't want to get. But these 3 diseases did not shut off our exports. These 3 diseases are the ones we're focusing on. Foot and mouth disease, which affects all cloven-hoofed animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, deer. Classical swine fever, which is hog cholera, only affects pigs. And African swine fever, which only affects pigs. And these would shut off our trade. We'd lose our exports with these diseases. And that's because the U.S. is a member of the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE, as are almost every other country in the world. All of the countries in the world belong to that except for a few rogue nations. And the World Organization for Animal Health sets the rules on trade. And the World Trade Organization goes by those rules. So these rules are set by these 200 member countries voting on the rules for trade. And the rules are any country that has one of these 3 diseases, nobody needs to take their exports, and you're not violating any trade agreement. So on day 1 of an outbreak of one of these 3 diseases, our chief veterinary officer would notify the OIE, which is the acronym for World Organization for Animal Health. OIE would notify all 200 member countries, and all exports of fresh or frozen beef, pork, lamb would be stopped. Anything that's already on a ship heading to a different country would have to be sent back. So we would immediately lose our exports. State and federal officials would set up control areas around the infected premises, and all movement of animals and everything else would stop, and you'd have to have a permit for any movements, so you're hopefully not spreading the disease. Prices will drop dramatically because of the loss of exports. So the minimum control area around one of these diseases is 6.2 miles. And that's the control area that was used for high-path avian influenza. Anything within 6.2 miles was under a stop movement order and had to do biosecurity and surveillance and so forth. 6.2 mile radius is 120 square miles, and that in Iowa can involve a whole lot of livestock operations or poultry operations. And it's movement by permit only, so there'll be stop movement until you can put things in place and then get a permit to move animals, bring feed on, and so forth. What we're working on are secure food supply plans with state, federal officials and industry, how we can get those things moving again as quickly as possible. And the reason it's such a big problem or such a big financial issue is because we've been so successful in increasing our exports. This is the percent of federally inspected beef and pork exported between 1988 and 2016. 1988, if we lost our exports, it wasn't a big deal. Now it's a really big deal. You can see in 2003 when we had one case of mad cow disease and we lost all of our beef exports. And it took quite a number of years to get that back again, almost 6 or 8 years, and now we're back to where we were before that BSE case. And we've just opened up the market to China, which should help our exports and prices. Pork exports, in 2016, about 26% of the pork is exported. And the pork board wants to get up to 30 or 35%. And that's great for animal agriculture. It helps the price of corn and soybeans and keeps our agriculture productive and profitable. But the more we increase it, the bigger the cliff we fall off of if we get foot and mouth disease and lose both of these exports, prices will go down the limit every day for several days until it finds a new bottom, and that'll be a big problem. And there's not much we can do about that. I mean, that's going to happen whether we get the disease right under control in a short time or a long time. And it takes a long time to regain exports. This shows in 5 recent outbreaks in countries that used to be free and had an outbreak of FMD. And I don't know if you can see it from the back, but we'll just look at Japan had 2 outbreaks, 2000, 2010. The blue bar is the length of the outbreak. From first to last case was about 2 months. The red bar is how long it took the OIE to say, yes, we agree that Japan is free of FMD. And that was about 300 days after a 2-month-long outbreak. The green bar is how long it took the US to agree that Japan was free. So after a 60-day outbreak, it was about 750 days before we were convinced they were really free and we would accept their exports, which is almost nothing from Japan to the US for beef anyway. And it's likely if we have an outbreak, we'll be fantastically lucky if we can keep it to just a couple months. It'll probably be much longer. And our trading partners are going to remember that it took us a long time to agree they were free. And if we get it, in order to convince the OIE and our trading partners that we're free, if it's an outbreak of any size at all, we'll have to do surveillance testing on all of our cattle, all of our pigs, all of our sheep and goats to prove that we don't have it. Prove to the OIE, prove to our trading partners. And that'll be a very long, extensive, and expensive process. So in 2011, the pork board asked Dr. Dermot Hayes, an economist at Iowa State, to estimate what would the cost be if we got foot and mouth disease. And the assumption was that if we got it and it got out of control, we'd have it for at least 10 years probably. So over 10 years, he estimated the cumulative losses would be $200 billion. And that would be $57 billion for pork, $71 billion for beef, $1 billion for poultry because beef and pork become cheap, so poultry becomes cheaper. $44 billion for corn and $25 billion for soybeans because there aren't as many animals eating the corn and soybeans. So it would be a huge economic impact, not just for livestock, but for crops, and indeed probably across the whole U.S. economy. So a little bit about foot and mouth disease. It's the most contagious disease of animals. It spreads very easily. It's the major animal disease preventing world trade of animals and animal products. So any country that's positive for FMD basically can't export their uncooked beef or pork. In adult animals, the morbidity is high, meaning almost all of them will get sick, but very few of them will die. Most adult cattle and swine will recover, They may not recover fully to full production, but they'll live through it. The high mortality we associate with foot and mouth disease is because of the stamping out, the rapid killing, if possible, of all the animals. Young animals can have high mortality. Young pigs and calves, depending on the strain of the virus, it might be up to 50% of those animals can die from the virus. It's not a public health or food safety concern. That's a very important message we need to get out to everybody. If we get this disease, it's a bad animal disease. It's not a human health concern. So keep eating the meat, drinking the milk. It's not, and working with the animals, people don't need to worry about it for their health. It is a bad animal disease. Painful blisters in the mouth, so they don't want to eat. Blisters on the feet, sometimes pigs will slough their hooves, so they don't want to stand up. And on the teats, so they don't want to be milked. And in 2 or 3 weeks, they'll begin to recover. So they have high fevers, blisters, and then in 2 or 3 weeks, they start recovering if they're not stamped out. This shows where foot and mouth disease is endemic. The green areas are free of foot and mouth disease. All these other countries, 96 countries, have it. And we've been very, very lucky it hasn't been accidentally or intentionally introduced from one of those 96 countries. In those countries, many of them vaccinate extensively, because if you're going to have any kind of efficient animal agriculture, you have to vaccinate everything, or at least the cattle. But some countries in Africa don't even vaccinate, they just live with it. They get it, get over it, and they're just endemic. So it's out there, and it could come in fairly easily. And we've had 9 outbreaks of foot and mouth disease. Between 1870 and 1929, in a 59-year period, we had 9 outbreaks. And now we've gone 88 years with no outbreaks. So laws were put in place to prevent animals coming in that weren't tested, prevent meat products coming in. So we've been very good and very lucky not to have an outbreak for 88 years. All of these outbreaks were controlled by stop movement and stamping out. In these years, there were no diagnostic tests. All they had was, you see the blisters, you know you've got it. And the officials would stop all movement in that area, kill the affected herd and all neighboring herds as quickly as possible to stamp out the virus. And that worked 9 times. But now our animal agriculture has changed so much that the USDA decided about 10 years ago, we may not be able to stamp it out. We're going to have to be prepared to respond in new ways. We have extremely large herd sizes, feedlots with 50 or 100,000 cattle, 20,000 dairy cows on one farm, huge swine operations. And these operations tend to locate in the same region for efficiency purposes, so it's hard to stop the spread. We saw that with avian influenza in northwest Iowa. Lots of huge egg layer operations, and it spread between them. And extensive movement of animals. Animals are moving every day on the roads. About 1 million pigs every day, about 400,000 cattle are on trucks every day moving, and that animals can be infected for up to 4 days before they show clinical signs. So we can be moving animals that have it and not even know it. We don't have good enough biosecurity to stop this virus. Public resistance to massive stamping out, and carcass disposal is an issue. Even if you could kill 50,000 head of calves in a feedlot within 24 to 48 hours, you have to kill them fast or there's no point killing them. You kill them fast to stop the virus replicating. Even if you could kill them, how are you going to get rid of the carcasses? And then we have a lot of deer and feral swine that can carry the virus either on their hooves or they can be infected, and they wander between herds pretty freely. So it's not likely to be a good picture if we get it. And we have very large operations, which we're all aware of, but we also need to remember we have a lot of small operations. For hogs, about 85 or 90, or 86% of the swine are on operations with more than 2,000 head, and that's only 9,000 operations. But there are 48,000 operations with less than 100 head of pigs. And Dr. Overton and other officials are going to have to deal with all of those, not just the big operations. You're going to have to make sure it's dealt with on all of those. Dairy cows, half of them are on operations with more than 1,000 cows, and that's 1,800 operations in 2012. And there's almost 19,000 operations with less than 30 cows. So we still have a lot of small dairies out there, family dairies, and all of those we have to deal with the disease on, which will be challenging. Now the stop movement is very important, and isolation, self-isolation to protect your herd. And this shows South Dakota and Iowa livestock inventories, and we're pretty similar, except for swine. Beef, dairy, sheep, goats, bison in South Dakota, it's easier for them to stop movement for days or weeks and self-isolate and still take care of their animals. Swine, in Iowa, we have 22 million hogs and pigs, and it's nearly impossible to stop movement for swine. This shows concept of swine movement from breeding to farrowing, weaning, finishing to market. About 400 to 500,000 pigs, almost 500,000, are going to market every day. If you stop movement and stop sending that 500,000 to market, this conveyor belt grinds to a halt very quickly, and animals pile up, and you've got to do something with them because there's a lot of pregnant sows waiting to get into that farrowing house. It's one of the reasons swine production is so efficient is because they've got this efficiency of movement, and it's just not compatible with stopping movement. If you stop movement, you're going to have to start putting them someplace or putting them down. And this shows how it's changed from 1990 to 2011, the number of animals, of pigs, crossing state lines. 1990, about 4 million pigs crossed state lines that year, and it's about 40 million in 2011. 22.5 million of those came into Iowa. So we depend on moving hogs across state lines. They're born somewhere else, and they come to where the corn and soybeans are for finishing. Every state animal health official has jurisdiction over what can enter their state. And most of them, we'll get into that more, but if your state's negative and another state's positive for FMD, you really don't want to allow those animals to come into your state, and your producers don't want you to allow those animals to come into your state. So if we can't bring those 22 million hogs into Iowa for finishing and packing, you have to have the packing plants. How's that going to work? What are you going to do with those that can't cross state lines? So it's a big, it would be a big problem. The ways to control FMD traditionally have always been stop movement, and we've talked about in some parts of the industry that's very hard to do. Biosecurity, and we don't have good enough biosecurity now. Stamping out, and for large, if it gets into areas with large animal populations, we probably won't be able to stamp out quickly enough. Tracing, trace back to find out quickly where did that disease come from before it got to that farm. Trace forward, when animals left that farm, where did they go? And we don't have good animal traceability. Rapid diagnostics, we're in better shape there than we used to be with our diagnostic labs. They have some surge capacity, but probably not enough in a big outbreak. And then vaccination will be extremely important. However, we'll get into that, we don't have enough vaccine. And we won't have in a big outbreak or even a small outbreak. So in planning for how would we respond to FMD, the old plan was stop movement and kill everything until it's gone, stamping out. So there were those who said we have to do that because we have to get rid of it. And there were others who said, well, but we might not be able to. What do we do if we can't stamp it out? So it's handling a foreign animal disease would be through the incident command system, which was developed for fighting forest fires. And it's a pretty good analogy. You're fighting a forest fire and it's going to blow past you. You have to back up and change your strategy. So we've come up with 6 different types of FMD outbreaks. If it's a small outbreak, do everything you can to stamp it out as quick as possible before it spreads. So a type 1 focal outbreak. If it gets to be a moderate regional outbreak, keep killing all those that you can and start vaccinating to slow the spread. Type 3, a large regional outbreak, you probably have to give up on killing everything and depend on vaccine to slow the spread. Type 4 is a widespread or national. Type 5 is a catastrophic U.S., where the whole U.S. is affected. Type 6 is a catastrophic North American, where U.S., Canada, and Mexico all have it. We get to type 5, this plan, which is just a plan, says that we would stop the eradication program and move to a long-term control program like tuberculosis control, pseudorabies control, brucella control, a multi-year program of working our way out of the disease, and we'd live with it for a long time. And we won't have enough vaccine to handle foot and mouth disease or hog cholera. There just won't be enough vaccine at the beginning of the outbreak. African swine fever, there's no vaccine anywhere in the world because it's a tough disease to vaccinate against. So we can't count on vaccination early on, at least. FMD vaccination is one of the toughest vaccines to use because there's 7 different serotypes and about 65 subtypes, and many of them don't cross-protect. So you have to have 23 different vaccines because you don't know which strain you're going to get. So the World Reference Laboratory says a stockpile should have 23 different vaccines in it to cover all the possible strains out there. And we currently don't have that. Currently, there's a North American FMD vaccine bank to be shared by US, Canada, and Mexico. It has about 2.5 million doses of about 14 different strains. On day 1 of the outbreak, you have to figure out which strain it is, and then you send that vaccine concentrate to England, where they turn it into vaccine and send it back. So after 2 to 3 weeks, we'd have about 2.5 million doses. And that's not going to be enough, and USDA knows that's not enough to control the outbreak. That's just enough to start really big fights about who gets it, but it's not enough to stop the outbreak. An additional vaccine production can take as long as 14 weeks, so we'd be a few months without vaccine probably. So the Animal Ag Coalition is requesting in the next Farm Bill, we heard about the Farm Bill this morning, $150 million a year for 5 years to establish an adequate vaccine stockpile. So we'd have enough vaccine to jump on the disease right away and get it shut down, hopefully. And $30 million to enhance the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. That's our state veterinary diagnostic labs. So there would be another $30 million to help our diagnostic labs get prepared for surge capacity, including the South Dakota lab, and $70 million to be made available to state animal health officials to increase their capacity to respond, because a lot of this will fall on the state. So the Animal Ag Coalition recognizes that the huge problem FMD or these other diseases would be, and that we've got to invest in preparedness to be more prepared. And if we stop stamping out, that means we're going to have to manage herds through the disease outbreak. So if your operation becomes infected and if the government requires stamping out and killing the animals, they pay indemnity for the animals. If they stop stamping out, there's no indemnity, and the producer stands the loss of the disease like any other disease. So you'd have to manage through an FMD outbreak, manage your animals. So, and we don't know what that'll look like. We've never seen FMD go through very large herds of high health status animals. So what's likely to happen is it'll spread fast through your herd. In a couple of weeks, almost all your animals would get it. 2 or 3 weeks later, most of them would be recovered. You might have 1 to 5% death loss, a loss of production, loss of milk production, rate of gain in feed efficiency would be bad. And then you've got an immune herd. So now you're immune from infection, not vaccination. But you and your veterinarian are going to have to figure out how to manage through that. And we don't quite know what it'll look like, but it won't be good. Probably be a lot of secondary bacterial infections and other issues. So we've been working on secure food supply plans. We started avian influenza about 10 years ago, and it was in place for the big outbreak that we had. And the secure milk supply on how you can move milk if you're under a quarantine order or stop movement order. Secure beef supply, how to show that your herd is negative, so you can send them to the packing plant from the feedlot, and then secure pork supply plan. These are all funded by USDA and all developed working with state, federal officials and industry. So the first thing that happens is a control area is set up. And if you're not in a control area, you can keep moving. If you are in a control area, that's where you have the stop movement. And with avian influenza, they use the smallest control area, 6.2-mile radius. Foot and mouth disease, it may well be a whole county or even a whole state that's under a stop movement until it's figured out where it's at. So in order to move, you're going to have to get a permit from the state and federal officials to move. And to get a permit, you're going to have a premises identification number. So everybody is encouraged to get a PIN, premises identification number. The integrated swine industry pretty well all has it, but you really need to have a PIN number for your premises ahead of the outbreak so you're ready to request movement permits. And you can get those from your state animal health officials. The challenge is, in an outbreak, the producers and the state officials that are in a state that doesn't have it don't want anything moving that might bring it to their farm. The producers that are trapped in a control area and can't move want things to move. So it depends on if you're a have or a have not, how you feel about movement of animals. So it's a real dilemma, especially for state animal health officials. There are serious consequences if you don't allow things to move, and a lot of worries if you do allow things to move. So these plans are trying to put plans in place, things to think about, to be able to have some assurance that it's safe to move those animals. So these secure food supply plans have some common components. There's voluntary pre-outbreak preparedness. These are all guidelines only. The officials will make the decisions they have to make based on what's going on. Biosecurity that should be in place ahead of time has to be in place afterwards, surveillance, permit guidance, and so forth. Biosecurity is expensive and it's inconvenient. Producers put the level of biosecurity in place that they have to stay in business with endemic diseases. But for endemic diseases, the normal diseases we deal with, the herd already has herd immunity probably. So there's very low level of virus production and high levels of resistance. But for foreign animal diseases, there's no herd immunity. So there's no resistance. When the virus comes in, there's very high production of virus, and it takes just a very low dose to infect animals that have no immunity. And we saw that with avian influenza. It spread much faster than we thought it would. In Iowa, in a 2-month period, we lost 31.5 million poultry, cost the Iowa economy $1.2 billion and the federal government $1 billion to clean it up. We thought when we did the secure egg supply plan that it would be backyard chickens with no biosecurity that got infected, and then the very large 4 or 5 million hen operations, laying operations, would be stuck and wouldn't be able to move their eggs. Well, as it turned out, we only had 6 backyard sites, and we had 71 commercial sites with birds indoors, and they thought they had good biosecurity. We found out that it wasn't good enough. So we've come up with new recommendations for biosecurity for the poultry industry, and then we're extending it, recommendations for beef, swine, and dairy. Some of the major concepts are a biosecurity manager, one person who's responsible for biosecurity. Hospitals have that. They have infection control officers. So one person whose responsibility is to write a plan and make sure that plan is followed. And then a checklist of anything that might bring the disease onto the place, and make sure you're controlling each one of those items. Now, we developed this checklist for poultry. When we were developing the secure egg supply plan, the industry officials were saying, well, what is the government going to make us do before we can move our eggs and to keep our flocks safe? After the big outbreak, the poultry industry changed their attitude very, very quickly. Now the industry is saying, this is what I want to make sure my neighbor is doing so he isn't bringing disease close to me. So these 12 points, the National Poultry Improvement Plan, which is a voluntary plan, but any large turkey egg producer has to belong in order to sell their product. the producers added a required auditing, third-party audit, to make sure everybody's actually doing this biosecurity, because they want to make sure their neighbor is doing all the right things. So you can read about these secure food supply plans on our website. There's a whole lot of information there. Secure beef, secure milk, secure pork, and the poultry plans. And the biosecurity recommendations are there and all kinds of other information. So, and it's all voluntary before an outbreak. But voluntary implementation reduces the likelihood that a herd will become infected with the FAD. It enables movement of animals sooner after the start of outbreak. There'll still be a stop movement, but you should be able to get your animals moving sooner. And it'll contribute to the overall success of the control of the outbreak. So that was a real quick run through of a lot of work that's been done and information that's in place. We hope that all of this work we did never ever gets used, but if there's an outbreak, it'll be needed.
Okay. Well, I'll ask both of our panelists to remain up here, and hopefully everybody's got their brain stimulated this morning. We'll be passing around the exam here shortly, so we can see how well you retain the information here. I think, really some timely topics here. I really, again, appreciate the information, and they are distilling quite a large volume of information down to really, I think, just the practical level for your awareness. But I'd open it up for questions now, and I'm sure we've got some questions from the crowd to either of our speakers. Okay, I'll start. Well, okay, Bob. There you go.
How important is isolation when we see concentrations of, the pork industry, of the pork industry, the chicken industry, turkey industry, and even livestock as well too, like Bennigan's, all feedlots or Iowa feedlots. Is it strategically important to say, well, maybe we should look at that and say, if it's a 6-mile radius, the infection becomes really important to us and isolation becomes important to us? Are we better to spread out those facilities as part of a long-term strategic plan?
Well, it would be better. In the avian influenza outbreak, it tended to be in northwest Iowa, where there are a lot of them close together. And what really tended to spread it was sharing of people and sharing of equipment. But what we see is it's more efficient in the absence of a foreign animal disease to put a lot of feedlots in the Texas Panhandle or a whole lot of dairy cows in the Central Valley of California. But in an outbreak, that's going to facilitate disease spread. So strategically, it is better. And what we see in the swine and poultry industry is that the breeder flocks or breeder herds tend to locate, isolate themselves. So it would be better, but that would be long-term because these facilities are already built and they're already very expensive.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Bob, too, there's some thought and recognition. Dr. Roth showed the movement of pigs, for example, has increased so much, and of course the reason for that is we've completely changed the way that swine production works from a single site to multi-sites, several sites throughout production, and I think it's fairly well recognized that's risky, and yet, like Dr. Roth said, in the absence of disease, it's a very efficient way to do that. So we kind of have that. As we've progressed over the last century in reducing some of those diseases that used to plague our industry, we've perhaps chosen methods of production that put us at greater risk for diseases that our populations are naive to. So.
We do have a question that came in online, so I'll just read it. It's for Dr. Adley. Wondering if you can speak to how much of the antibiotic chlorotetracycline is fed to beef cattle versus poultry and swine?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is no. It's simple. Next. But being a professor, I got to go on for a couple minutes, right, Jim? That's our required. Just required. So to counter that, or to try to address that, the FDA, Center for Veterinary Medicine, is required to collect antibiotic use sales data according to the Animal Drug User Fee Act, the DUFA. They're required to do that, and anyone selling antibiotics, medically important antibiotics, with a food animal label is required to report that every year. The FDA required the companies for 2016 data to estimate how much of each sales went to each species. So for a drug like Tiamulin, Denigard, which is labeled for swine, that's pretty straightforward, easy. For a drug like chlortetracycline, which could go in multiple food animal species, to track that down through is going to be an estimate, kind of internal survey on how much of that is going there. So for 2016 data that will be reported, there'll be estimates. And then there are 2 FDA cooperative agreements which are starting to evaluate antibiotic use in beef feedlot cattle, dairy, swine, and poultry production. We hold the cooperative agreement for beef and dairy. They are samples of convenience to establish methods, but our first report will be out in the end of this year.
Yes, I was really intrigued by the number of cases that you reported that were resistant to antibiotic use that you received at K-State. Is there something that we, and I'm in the dairy industry, need to be doing so that this resistance, when you get especially respiratory and young cattle, is there something that we need to be doing different than what's been recommended to us as far as our vaccination protocol? Or where do we start to minimize, because it becomes a problem if we're administering antibiotics and you're finding out that we're wasting our money because the organisms that's causing the problem is resistant to them.
Sure, and it's a great question. And the number one thing is, and I'm a veterinarian, so it sounds rather self-serving, but I feel that all antibiotic use should be within the context of a complete health plan with your veterinarian. And sometimes producers will come up and say, well, our veterinarian isn't able to give us much support in that. My response is find another veterinarian. There are a lot of veterinarians out there who work very, very hard to be really up on immunization, epidemiology of the disease, et cetera. And so, in your example, it might be young stock, where you see, of course, in a lactating dairy cow, number one challenge requiring antibiotics is mastitis. Young stock, we've got respiratory disease and enteric disease. So the epidemiology of those, ventilation in those in that young stock, wherever you have them, and then routine surveillance. If you're running into, for example, an enteric disease problem, we really need to define the time at which it's happening, and if it's bacterial or viral components, and then zero in on the components, figure out what it is. If there is a salmonella or E. coli component, then figuring out how that's happening, how it's being transmitted, and then following it up with susceptibility testing of the pathogens to see if we do have some resistance developing is very important. So it's all one big plan, a lot of different moving parts, involves how those calves are moved. I remember one place, we had a grad student in watching, and they'd never caught it before, but they were having a lot of scourge problems in the young calves, and what they were doing was had a skid steer platform made that they could haul calves in that attached on the front, and they'd haul the calves out of the barn, they'd load them in there in the straw that were having the problems when they were in there, and hauling them over to the transition facility, and then just swinging back by and picking up some newborns and bringing them right back to the facility where they're having the problems. We don't have a needle that can fix that. So it's management, overall programs, identifying what they are, and on those respiratory pathogens, it's not everybody, you know, but it's an identifiable small group where a series of management practices involved down the line that get them to us is not consistent with us maintaining the use of those antibiotics. So start with that, start with a veterinarian that really wants to be involved with that, and start back with all the things that could prevent having the problems in the first place.
Just do a quick follow-up on that, is that you know, notice how many times he said we need to find out, we need to test, we need to ask these questions, and the management part of it is so crucial, but those management decisions often require other information, and of course we've got our veterinary diagnostic lab to help answer those questions, and there's you know, there's very little that as veterinarians we can just look over the fence and say, oh yeah, it's this, treat with that. You know, we really should be asking more questions, not only what's causing the problem, but what are those management factors. And so it's tough to make a blanket recommendation, you know, to your question, obviously, because it requires such an individual approach.
So I have a question for both of you. Thank you for coming, first of all. The first one, Dr. Apley, what's the most promising alternative to antibiotics that you see in the future? What kind of research? I know there's been a lot of talk on probiotics and that type of thing. What do you think?
So to look for something that we could say we're having effective control or treatment with an antibiotic here, we can just pull it out and plug that in. I'm struggling to see something that's that effective. And on both the human and veterinary side, antibiotics are a really, really effective tool when we have a susceptible bacterial population. They're incredibly effective. That's why we use them. They're a valuable tool. To replace them, or a place where they are integral to the health and welfare of the animals, to just replace them would take a combination of things. Maybe a few products, some management changes. I'll tell you what we're figuring out too is the genetic contribution to health was blown off for a lot of years. And now in beef cattle, I know for pneumonia, I think we're dealing with the heritability in the mid-.2s, which is worth paying attention to. And there's some success stories out there of people going back and looking at the genetic contributions to disease. So the answer is a lot of things together, but for replacing one bottle with another, not so much right now that I know of. And here's the guy on the immunological part of that. You say you know 4? Yeah. No, he doesn't. He said, okay.
So there was some success with Clostridium difficile and fecal transplants in people?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Do you see that type of thing?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is the fact that people with C. diff, Clostridium difficile infections in humans, and recurring problems. And C. diff happens because the Clostridium difficile is resistant to the antibiotic being used. It overgrows, produces toxins. And what they've discovered in people is well, we're halfway between meals, is that fecal transplant of reestablishing normal flora in their gut actually has a lot to do with that. And man, I've got to give up the mic before we go down the rabbit hole of the interaction of our gut microflora with our health. It's essentially another organ, communicates with the same hormones. You've probably all heard about the gut health relation to our health, but that's huge. And there is potential in that with us. And of course, at the human meetings when they're talking about this, I like to go, we've been doing rumen transplants in cows, or transphonations in cows for like 50 years, so welcome to the party. You know, that's good. So.
Thank you. And Dr. Roth, so you don't see clinical signs from foot and mouth disease for like 4 days when they could still be shedding it. So my question is, I know there was some talk about doing milk testing on a routine basis. Is that something that's still being considered?
So there is a PCR, a rapid test to detect FMD in milk samples. But that wouldn't be quick enough to test milk before it leaves the farm in the volume that we would need to do. So it would be used more as a screening test for a herd to pick up early infection. But it's not going to be used ahead of the outbreak. But if we get into an outbreak, that is a new tool, PCR testing of milk, Also oral fluid samples in swine. We need to develop better sampling methods for beef cattle, maybe water samples from saliva in the water or something where you don't have to catch the animal and take a blood sample every day.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for a lot of your data here. As an economist, one of the questions that I've got in terms of impact, you talked about a 6.2-mile radius, and that's animal movement. Am I right in that?
Yes.
I remember during the FMD outbreak in the UK that in fact where they had significant infection across a large number of herds, they restricted all movement in certain counties. That would put a very different perspective on the impact that you're talking about. Has there been any discussion of that? And you ultimately talked about, you know, when we look at this shedding and you look at the expanse of the disease spread, that it's really not coming, it's coming from sort of extraneous movement, not the animal movement. It's the people who are moving from one location to another, which was why they ended up doing this in Britain. Can you address that a little bit in terms of whether that's been discussed?
There's been a lot of discussion on how large the control area should be. And that'll be up to the state animal health officials based on what they know about the outbreak. And at the beginning, they won't know very much. So quite a few of the state animal health officials, we should let Dr. Odekoven weigh in on this, but several of them have said they would stop movement in their whole state until they have some idea where it's at. Because at the beginning of an outbreak, you might have a chance to stamp it out. You don't want to lose that chance. But stopping everything, the problem with stopping it in a big area is once you stop it, you have to figure out how to restart it. And you have to have some data to restart it. So it's a real dilemma on how to do that. And animal movement's only one part of it, as you said. People, vehicles, wildlife, lots of ways that it can spread.
You mentioned the UK outbreak in early 2000, 2001, and I was still hanging out with these two at that time. But as I understand from visiting with Dr. Holland, Governor Janklow was the governor at the time, and there were a lot of discussions at that time, and really the development of the plans that we still have in place now that did involve a lot of discussion of just shutting down all movement, no people included. And that authority is there if we need to do that. I think, when you really think about the reality of that, that's difficult to comprehend. But also was mentioned earlier in Dr. Roth's presentation some examples of other countries that have dealt with FMD in in 2010, I believe. It was either the Korean outbreak or the Japanese outbreak, where they struggled for a while to get a handle on it until they stopped movement of people because they were addressing the animal issues, they were addressing the premises where the outbreak were occurring, but there was still a lot of movement of people, and that was what was transmitting the virus to other areas outside of the control zone. So certainly it's an option, and I think depending on the size and type of outbreak, as Dr. Roth had his graph up here, depending on what we're dealing with and what stage that we're in, it potentially could be could be involved. Our initial response plan calls for everybody to stay put on the, if we were to find the very first index case, there would be no movement of people, animals, or anything off of that place until we could, until we could get a handle on it. As it goes on, and we're involved in some of those, permitted movements, obviously, our goal is to resume continuity of business, and that includes all types of business, not just livestock business. But a good point. Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. And again, I want to thank our panelists, and thank you both for making the trip to South Dakota and for the presentation today. Thanks a lot.